Rethinking the war in Afghanistan. A new report says the threat of al-Qaeda and the Taliban is exaggerated and the West's strategy is too ambitious. With the US about to review its own progress at the end of the year, how will this impact future strategy in Afghanistan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. The US strategy in Afghanistan needs a fundamental rethink. That's according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The security think tank issued a report saying the threat of al-Qaeda and the Taliban is exaggerated and that the strategy in Afghanistan has ballooned out of proportion from the original aim of preventing attacks by al-Qaeda. In addition, it says the strategy is too ambitious, too removed from the core security goals that need to be met, and too sapping of diplomatic and military energies needed both in the region and elsewhere. Now, the report recommends restructuring combat forces to deter and prevent an organized terrorist threat. In terms of governance, it suggests a more balanced power-sharing system. While the capital formally rules, provinces should be given control over some issues. Similarly, the Afghan National Army should be provisional as well as federal. Uniformed local security forces should be nationally recognized. And going beyond the Afghan borders, the report suggests the strategic goals of India and Pakistan in Afghanistan should be managed. And to reconcile concerns that Russia and Iran may have about military presence in Afghanistan, the report recommends a less ambitious coalition military in the country. Well, joining us now today are our guests. In Washington, D.C., Steve Clements, Director of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation. Also in Washington, Richard White, Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. And in London, Afghanistan expert and author of Dining with Terrorists, Phil Reese. Gentlemen, I want to welcome all of you to the program. Richard White, if I could start with you, what do you make of the findings of this report? Does the strategy in Afghanistan need a complete rethink to more limited and realistic goals?
First of all, I just want to point out this. Actually, it's very good that Steve Clements is on the panel as well, just because there's a report out by New America, which he can talk about, which is very similar to the IISS report and maybe more influential. I think both of the papers have an interesting idea, and I think that it's something that we need to consider. We have to keep on asking ourselves whether the Afghan campaign is worth it and what is the appropriate cost to bear for what may not be the highest objectives in U.S. foreign policy. That said, I think it would be premature to implement the recommendations in these reports because we've seen the current strategy, the larger counterinsurgency nation-building strategy, although it isn't called nation-building, may work. It would still a bit early, I think, to give up on that because we've just had the surge of U.S. combat troops in the area, and it's only taking effect now. So I would wait at least a year, maybe two, to see what happens, because we've seen in civil wars the outcome is often very unpredictable. Iraq.
But does President Obama have that long? Does President Obama have that long to wait? I mean, we've got this July 2011 date for a drawdown set at the moment, and then 6 months on from then we have the beginning of another presidential election year. I mean, politically, can he afford to wait much longer to see any kind of progress in Afghanistan?
I think so. I think that it's because although the polls are shifting a bit against the war, it's not the most salient issue in American voters' minds. And basically, unlike Iraq or especially Vietnam and some of the other wars, it's not been really dominating the political landscape. And I think that the president has sufficient leeway, especially since the Republicans, if anything, are more continuing the surge and upkeeping. So I think that if President Obama thinks it's the correct strategy, he will retain sufficient support in Congress and among the elite foreign policy community inside Washington who really pays attention and considers the issue important to sustain it.
Steve Clements, has the U.S. bitten off more than it can chew here? I mean, you wrote in an opinion piece recently that Afghanistan, and I'm quoting you here, Afghanistan has now become the Moby Dick to Obama's Ahab. Now, just explain to us, what exactly did you mean by that, particularly for the benefit of those of us who perhaps may not have read Moby Dick?
Well, what I meant by it is that Afghanistan is growing in, I think, a disproportionate way in the portfolio of challenges the United States has in its national security portfolio. And with after General McChrystal was fired and after General Petraeus was appointed, Barack Obama basically doubled down on the counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. It's looming larger, and it's looming larger and larger because it's got the largest growing budget. We're now spending about $100 billion a year in Afghanistan on just military terms. That doesn't include allies or NGO expenses in a country with a GDP of $14 billion, and things aren't going well. The IISS report and the release of the report that we did yesterday by the Afghanistan Study Group at the New America Foundation are being written because people are having to reconsider other policy options in case the current strategy really does go into the tank, and that is the concern. I agree with Richard that there's still time on the clock, but as we get closer and closer to December, where the real review of the Obama policy and the July 2011 date will begin in earnest, I think you're going to see a lot of people posturing and trying to put either to double down on what we're doing now or to put alternative strategies out there. And I think that fundamentally, if they begin to get a virtuous cycle of successful benchmarks in what they're doing now, that maybe this will turn around and the IISS and New America efforts will look less significant. But they're looking significant because things aren't going well right now.
Phil Reese in London, how's this mission in Afghanistan been allowed to go from one of dismantling al-Qaeda to an entire nation-building exercise? And should Western powers be even doing this in the 21st century?
Well, I don't think they should, and I think most of us would have come to the conclusions that the IISS came to soon after 9/11, I'm afraid. You know, the United States could have declared a war on al-Qaeda, but at the time it declared a sort of war on terror, and I think that was deliberately done to cover a kind of new mission for America in the world, a kind of new imperialism that was fighting this general and ill-defined enemy called terrorism. And I think that its implications in Afghanistan meant that they were trying to sort of fight the Taliban, which itself had no sort of transnational ambitions and, you know, was the government of the country. And they felt that somehow they could bring American democracy and American values to that as part of this general dream that I think neocons in America, you know, were under some illusion that was born out of the events of 1989, by the way, with the collapse of communism in Europe, that somehow the whole world, if it was given the chance, wanted to be American. And clearly in Afghanistan, and anybody who knows Pashtunwali culture knows that they absolutely don't want to be at all and don't want anything to do with the United States, its democracy or its market values.
So if you think they should have come to this conclusion a lot sooner, then what do you think is behind the timing of this report? I mean, is it an attempt to prepare the public for an eventual withdrawal?
I think most clearly it is. I mean, if one could go back to just after 9/11, by the way, do you know that in the days after 9/11, Islamist groups, including Hamas, including the Jamaat Islamiyah in Pakistan, including the Muslim Brotherhood, all condemned 9/11. But what did the United States do? Rather than be generous and say it could work with Islamist groups around the world, it just brandished them all as terrorists and all threw them into the camp of transnationalist movements like al-Qaeda. So what's happened now? Well, basically, you know, the policy isn't working. It's absolutely no surprise. But there are another few factors have been. The West cannot afford the war anymore. Certainly Britain can. I don't think that Obama can. They can't see the end game in sight. So I think that if you look at, you know, what the IISS has done in the past, it's often been a flag waver. Remember that many of the people in think tanks like the ISS have come from the British military or the security services. One of its leaders is a former deputy head of MI6. So they tend to get information from the security services. That information is then presented publicly. The government then acts upon this information. So there's a kind of closed circuit of information. What you tend to find, therefore, is that, you know, these are waived to the public to try to generate a sort of opinion that would accept the result. And in fact, the IISS did this as well prior to the invasion of Iraq when it produced a document in 2002 that Tony Blair later used in what became known as the dodgy dossier to justify the invasion of Iraq, saying that in fact Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, which in fact we know now he didn't.
Steve Clements, one of the arguments that's been made in this report as well is that the presence of so many foreign troops right now is actually fueling the Taliban, because it provides them with a more visible target and a justification for their struggle. Is that a valid argument in your opinion?
I do think it is a valid opinion. I think that the so-called Taliban, which I think is coalescing and hardening the larger the military footprint becomes, is a real issue. And one of the outcomes of the report is that while you can't predict that everything would go well, if you imagined, say, 30,000 troops in Afghanistan, though I really advocate a full withdrawal, but say you had 30,000 troops, I don't think the mess that we have would necessarily be any different than 100,000 troops, with the exception that, as the other speaker just shared, the Pashtun are so animated and so ferociously independent in where they're going that they actually, the larger the military footprint becomes, the more easy the recruitment to the other side of this civil war becomes. I was very pleased that Richard White's mentioned the word civil war, because it's very rarely appears in most discussions. We recently had a New York Times editorial largely endorsing the current military strategy under David Petraeus that didn't mention the word civil war. And I think fundamentally Americans need to understand, and also other allies that have forces deployed, that this is a complex, very complex kind of civil war that on top of it has a regional proxy struggle between Pakistan and India and other players. And we've wedged ourselves right into the middle of it. And I think that we're unable to really set the terms of the equilibrium. There was a writer recently who shared that this is very much like Vietnam, where Lyndon Baines Johnson made the comment that he couldn't win the war but couldn't get out. And I think President Obama is facing that same kind of paralysis. And there are many of us, the IISS team under John Chipman and the group that I've helped put together, the Afghanistan Study Group here in Washington, that very much think that that's not an option, that we need to actually begin fleshing out this debate, having a larger national security debate, even though I agree with Richard that this issue of Afghanistan has been fairly buffered from the core concerns of the American public. I think that will change with time, but the American public is not deeply animated yet by the cost of Afghanistan.
Yeah, let's put some of that to Richard then. I mean, what Steve Clements was saying earlier, this idea that the Western powers may essentially be trapped in Afghanistan, in the sense that while they may prefer to pull out sooner rather than later, to leave now would only embolden the jihadist groups in their mind, in perhaps much the same way that the Russians were forced out of Afghanistan.
Yes, and there's another example of Somalia when the Islamists claimed that they forced withdrawal of President Bush, the first President Bush's Somalia expedition when it transitioned to President Clinton. That said, the problem with the Afghan conflict, it's not quite a civil war. It's like a mixture of civil war, counterinsurgency, because it's not totally one clear opposition movement within the Pashtuns. I mean, the Pashtuns themselves are divided, and there are other sources of conflict. But the concern is, again, what would happen in terms of not so much Afghanistan if we do, as say the IISS strategy says, is continually use force to attack any terrorist base and so on, but how it might affect, say, Afghanistan, but how it might affect Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan is thought to be much more crucial because of its possession of nuclear weapons, larger population. It's politically fragile. It's possible, and I would say probable, that if the Taliban gained control over a large part of Afghanistan, it would be hard not to have a positive feedback, in a sense of positive not for us, but positive for the Islamists, of bringing chaos to the rest of Pakistan, because that would just embolden more militarism there. Also, there are some other problems, I think, with the report in terms of the expression of localism. We have to be clear what that means. That means that women who happen to fall in the wrong part of the country are going to have a lot of problems. And Diplomatically, the Russians, which was mentioned as being happy to see a reduction in U.S. troops, is actually the opposite. Their complaint is NATO is not pursuing the war vigorously enough because they're very concerned with what happened in Chechnya. So I think it's a bit more complicated, but again, IISS said it didn't actually lay out a concrete, complex strategy. It was more a couple pages in the report and then an accompanying letter at the beginning.
All right, well, we'll take a look now at what implications these particular reports will have going forward, because all of this comes as the United States prepares to assess its own progress in Afghanistan. The top U.S. Commander, General David Petraeus, presents his report to Congress in December. Now, they'll be assessing if they're ready to reduce troop levels as planned from mid-July next year. And along similar lines, British Prime Minister David Cameron recently discussed with Obama the issue of withdrawing British troops from Afghanistan in 2011. Now, so David Petraeus is due to present this report in a couple of months to Congress, and he said earlier that this year that he's not necessarily tied to President Obama's drawdown date of July next year. That being the case, is he suggesting that the mission needs more time, and is he going to be able to convince Congress and the President of that?
Well, I think David Petraeus is laying the groundwork for things. Actually, I think the more important thing is happening about a week from now, where David Petraeus will be back in Washington engaging the first step of this, which was coordinating policy and discussions with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So while it's largely internal, that internal process is going to work forward to try to coalesce the views of the various command staff within the Pentagon as they sort of posture and tilt towards December. And there, frankly, is a the Pentagon is not monolithic on this and not completely behind General Petraeus. We also had the Marine Commandant recently, General Conway, essentially, I think, engage in near insubordination to President Obama by saying that the July 2011 date was giving sustenance to the enemy. That's a real defection from the current plan, and it's sort of pre-posturing, and I think in a very impolitic way. But nonetheless, the struggle over the next steps is beginning now, and it isn't just getting ready for December. And I think that David Petraeus, I don't know what's in his mind. I have met with him, I talked with him. I imagine that he has been sending signals that he's uncomfortable with the date that he has now, and I imagine he's going to begin laying the groundwork both within Congress and other stakeholders in the decision to try to shake off that date so that he doesn't have a drawdown in capacity. There's even been a rumor, and I don't know if it's true, that he's actually asked the president for another 2,000 trainers on top of the deployed forces that have already gone over, that have been topped off, as Richard White's just said. So while 2,000 may not look significant in the scale we have there, the fact that they would inch even a little bit higher has political consequences for the president. And I think that's the direction they're likely to try and coalesce as we get towards December and then into the new year.
Richard White, I mean, the argument's been made, perhaps, that this marking up this July 2011 dates essentially emboldens groups like the Taliban, because the argument goes that they simply, all they have to do is just wait out the coalition troops for that long, and then it's job done.
Well, the problem the president has got two audiences he has to address simultaneously, many, but two ones in terms of this context. He needs to tell the Taliban, we're going to be there forever, we'll fight you to the bitter end, you can't win victory, therefore you have to negotiate. But he has to be able to tell President Karzai that, well, look, we're not going to stick with you forever, you've got to make reforms and corruption, get your act together. And I guess you'd say the third audience is the U.S. public, which is, don't worry, we're not going to be there forever. So it's complicated because he's got a two-level, maybe perhaps a three-level game. He's got different audiences to meet. And when the president said that, there was some negative feedback immediately, and since then they've been backing off from that. And I think it was quite clear from the president's visit to Afghanistan earlier this year that he intends to keep U.S. forces there beyond that date. There might be a token withdrawal, but there's not going to be a major withdrawal under current plans unless things change in December.
Phil Reese, I mean, one of the conclusions, if we go back to this report by the IISS, one of the conclusions that it makes is that there needs to be a greater account of the regional dimensions here. I mean, does that mean less of a sort of with us or against us approach here? I mean, is this an area that needs to be addressed a lot more by the U.S. and its allies?
Well, obviously, Afghanistan isn't a country in that many people don't actually feel they're primarily Afghan, but they feel they're Tajik or Pashtun or whatever. And of course, you know, the great danger in this, and I think it's a phenomenal danger, is that the warlords, and you know, they are the same warlords that basically, in many cases anyway, governed in the 1980s as part of the Mujahideen rebellion against the Russians at that time. That they will simply take their own fiefdoms and govern them as they want, and you know, any prospects of any kind of global integration will be gone, and I think it will increase the prospects of civil war. What's more, this could spill into Pakistan. If the Pashtuns and the Taliban in fact have their foothold in Afghanistan, I think that could jeopardize the Pashtun and Baluchi independence movements in Pakistan. The Pakistanis are very, very worried about that. So I think that it could open an even more dangerous hornet's nest, if you will, and create an even more unstable country. So I don't particularly believe that regionalization in that sense will work. Of course, you know, maybe you could say Afghanistan isn't really a country, and perhaps in the long term, rather like Yugoslavia, it should be broken up, and that might be more stable. But that's, you know, there'd be a major war before that would happen, and certainly it's not something that can be done overnight.
Steve Clements, I mean, you want to respond to what some of Phil Reese said there, that it needs a lot more than just a regional approach here?
Well, I think this is why this is such a complex challenge. I think everything Phil just laid out is a prospect that certainly the Pakistan government is very worried about it, worried about the Baluchi movement, worried about disintegration along various ethnic lines. I think that said, in my book, what we advocate is there's got to be a reassessment of regional stakeholders and internal stakeholders, and they've got to be brought back. And I think that we've been too narrow in the willingness, particularly in the United States, has been, I think both the United States and Pakistan have played disruptive roles, if you will, in allowing the internal Afghanistan operation to try to reach a different equilibrium than it has today. And I think that has to happen. Otherwise, you begin fueling many of the trends that I think Phil just laid out. And I think there's another option. I'm not a doomsday scenario with this stuff going on, but I do think that the status quo approach that we're taking now is animating and inflaming an enormous amount of opposition to what we're doing, and that is thus empowering other kinds of movements that could become very disintegrative in that region.
All right.
I think is still, you know, an unlikely scenario in the long run.
Phil Reese,
because there are other options.
Final question to you, Phil Reese, briefly in the minute or so that we have left. It's been said that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. Is there any reason to believe at this point that the same fate may await the United States and its NATO partners here?
No, I mean, I think that the Taliban are already celebrating that. I mean, when I met a Taliban leader in Northwest Waziristan about 2 years ago, he celebrated defeating the British. He already said he defeated the Americans, the Russians, of course, and he was already looking forward to defeat the Chinese in a war that obviously hasn't even happened yet. So this is their mentality. And I think that the problem, finally, of the American withdrawal from there is that Islamism and jihadism will feel they have won, and that'll have implications in the rest of the Muslim world and in the Middle East in particular.
All right, that's going to have to be the last word. I want to thank all of our guests for taking part in the discussion. Steve Clements and Richard White in Washington, and Phil Reese in London. Gentlemen, many thanks for your time. That's it for this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send any comments or suggestions, you can, of course, email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.